So, firstly, good morning to Professor Sheth for joining from US, and good morning to all of those who are joining from Mexico and US. Good evening to all of the colleagues who are joining from within India and Dubai. It's indeed a great honor for all of us to have Professor Sheth address all of us. And Professor Sheth, thank you so much for your flexibility. I know at a very short notice you could accommodate our request of making the change in terms of your timing instead of 8 o'clock. Thank you so much. So we have this topic of global business landscape post COVID-19. And just for the information of all the audience, we'll be closing this at 9:30 because Professor Sheth has got another engagement starting immediately after. So without much ado, let me quickly welcome Professor Sheth. And Professor Sheth is a professor of business and marketing in Emory University. And he is also the winner of Padma Bhushan Award for 2020. Professor Sheth is honored with several awards globally, and he is regarded as the thought leader in the areas of strategy, business landscape globally, and marketing strategies and consumer behavior. And he has been regarded as a very celebrated thought leader, not only in Indian business schools, but also globally. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Sheth, and over to you. And the audience is really looking forward to listening to your thought leadership. Over to you, Dr. Sheth.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I think the delay is fine because I'm buffering myself with other meetings, so I can manage it. That's fine. I think it's a very timely topic about the global business outlook. I think this is going to be more transformative than we have recognized so far because we are in a lockdown mode every place, so we engage into other activities rather than focus about the future. What I will do is to really articulate first that major crises have always restructured industries over time. And therefore, it is important to understand what happened historically, and is there a repeat or is there something unique about the coronavirus or COVID-19? And I'll articulate that. It is going to have a significant impact on manufacturing and supply chain more so than on services. Both will get transformed, so I'll make a strong point about manufacturing excellence in the future post-COVID, how that will look like, and what are the things companies can do to survive the manufacturing aspects and the changes. And the last part is that the positioning of India in the whole geopolitical architecture and post-COVID economic architecture. I think those are the points I'll try to make. Hopefully we'll make it in time, but I more enjoy Q&A, so I will set aside some time compressing my presentation for more questions and answers from the audience. So let's put our slide number 1, please. So this is the title slide, Global Business Landscape Post-COVID-19. Let's go to the next slide. I have identified 4 major crises, and one before World War II, of course, was the Great Depression, which is a very much a common thing people talk about. I think the biggest transformer was always World War II. For 4 years, all manufacturing capacity, everything was basically primarily dedicated to preparing war products, and companies had to adapt to that one by mandate, by law, essentially. So diverted manufacturing for war efforts. Women, for the first time, worked on the factory. They might have worked in the clerical offices or the professional offices, but not in the manufacturing for the first time because there were no men. So this brought about a significant social change in the society, at least in the US, followed by obviously the European Union nowadays, or Western Europe. We will talk about that one. Last point is very key. The World War II destroyed Japanese economy, German economy, continental Europe in general, British economy, American economy therefore had a great chance to create a global expansion. For the first time after a major crisis, there was a global expansion as opposed to consolidation. Key difference, we'll talk about that in more detail. My favorite is the next one, which is the first energy crisis in the 70s and the 80s. When the oil prices went up, everybody depended so much on the oil, especially US, which was totally dependent on oil from foreign countries, especially Middle East, Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. So that was a very key change. And the first energy crisis brought about more significant restructuring of the industry. We decided to reduce the oil dependence pretty much, and this is a key issue in China right now as a growth engine for the world economy. Definitely was the case for Japan, but they are not self-sufficient, and also true for India. So oil became a very key commodity at that time, pretty much. We had a collapse of equity market. Because of the previous boom, people had borrowed a lot more money all of a sudden. So the debt to equity ratio went out of whack. And when the equity collapses, and we have the days of conglomerates in those days, where you had a highly unrelated, diversified businesses, and all of a sudden they could not pay the debt obligations. So we invented junk bonds. Michael Milken was the key architect of that one. And of course, private equity came in and took over the companies. So private equity was a very important new capital that came in the marketplace, other than the traditional debt and the public equity market. Watch the private equity coming back again in a big way. This is the time when Warren Buffett became a multi-billionaire, Berkshire Hathaway. KKR was another one. Today, the parallel would be obviously Blackstone and BlackRock, for example. And there are many other corporations at a much higher level of private capital in their hands, and I'll talk about that in some way. So we have to really go back to first energy crisis and learn quite a lot of lessons. Next slide, please. The next one is that the growth did not come through. Industry was basically consolidating. So all governments thought that the way to create additional growth now is going to be primarily liberalization of trade. Trade is a platform. So we abolished all the trade restrictions, the tariffs, the restrictions about taxes, entry points, whatever is allowed, not allowed, etc. The GATT agreements at one time. And we replaced that actually with the WTO. Basically, worldwide trade would be there, free flow as much as possible to create economic stimulus on a global economy. We also engaged into regional free trade agreements. For example, NAFTA became more real right after this time, pretty much, even though it was articulated earlier. And of course, European Union came more than just a free trade agreement, but the whole regionalization of a bunch of nations into a one federation. We also saw around this time the rise of emerging markets. People began to talk about Goldman Sachs BRIC report, that is obviously Brazil, Russia, India, China. Some has come through and others have not. We'll talk about that a little later on. But the key message is that there was a global consolidation of industries. In fact, governments allowed at that time to consolidate. Even competitors could buy each other out, which was a liberalization of the antitrust laws, which is important to watch again, whether that will happen again. And financial crisis came in. There was a financial crisis of 2008 and 9, which we have all experienced. There was a bailout of the banks, for example. There was a new monetary policy, QE, there's a typo, there should be QE, for example, quantitative easing. And again, we saw a significant consolidation of industries on a global basis. Next slide, please. How will coronavirus be unique this time? First of all, this is the first time where the economy has come down on a fast elevator. Think about Burj Khalifa in Dubai. All buildings, which are advanced economies, and the elevator has come down so fast, economies shut down worldwide with the same things, because we put together primarily the lockdown procedures and of course social distancing. But it will only recover very slowly by climbing the stairs. In fact, this morning in Wall Street Journal, they're coining a new phrase which is very similar to the point I'm making. It'll be called a swish economy. Air Jordan, which is one of the Nike type shoes, where air comes out fast but then gets back into very slowly. So this will be sector by sector economic recovery as opposed to whole economy recovering by itself. And this happened because we shut down the consumer demand by lockdown and social distancing. Greater impact of this one was on small and medium enterprises. In the US, 97% or more are all small businesses under 100 employees. So the large businesses is about 50% of the economy. Small businesses together is under 50% of the economy. And in small and medium businesses, vast majority are owner-managed businesses. Vast majority are very few employees, 5 to 10 employees, and they began to collapse. Consumer demand, which drives economies like America, also India now, and China, began to actually experience significant downturn because consumers were not allowed to go outside to do shopping or relaxation, whatever it is. Travel was banned, for example. So it all affects. However, there is a very interesting chart I have, shortage here and surplus there, which means some part of the consumer economy began to actually boom because of the coronavirus and the lockdown procedures, for example, delivery at home. While everybody's struggling, Amazon actually hired more than 120,000 new employees because they could not keep up with the demand. Devices or the networks like the Zoom began to grow enormously. Anything that was technology that was enabling people to live their lives became quite real, important, and therefore grew enormously. So that was a very key component. So there's a shortage, like the travel is totally collapsed. Hospitality industry the same way. Department stores, for example. And if they could do online somehow by shifting the demand fulfillment to online processes or delivery at home, it began to survive a little more. I also expect that this COVID-19 will create another major global consolidation, but in a different way than the way we have saw during the first energy crisis. I totally am convinced next 10 years will be all about private capital, and they will dominate our equity and the debt markets. And the private capital has a component of sovereign funds, which will be used for certain sectors of the economy. But watch, as I mentioned before, companies like Blackstone and BlackRock, $7 trillion of assets they own, they're much bigger and they can call the shots pretty much about the companies that are listed, especially large enterprises or diversified enterprises, just like in the first energy crisis. Next slide, please. So here is the fundamental shift in manufacturing and supply chain that goes with it. The current practice is to make the products and ship them locally, globally, however you do it. It will definitely shift more and more toward what I call demand-driven manufacturing. In other words, the orders are placed and then you begin to assemble the product or make the product, rather than that impacts the supply chain in terms of raw materials and that approach primarily. And the other dimension, very important, and I've been very surprised myself because I thought manufacturing was so automated. Manufacturing is one of the lowest low-tech industries I've found. Especially when you compare to the Silicon Valley companies, manufacturing therefore will have to go from low-tech to high-tech. There will be significant opportunities therefore to acquire businesses across countries, mostly because people will not have the capital, or they will have to use private capital or private equity, if you wanted to use the word, to pretty much carry out the journey, as we did again in the 70s, first oil and energy crisis. Many companies sold them to private equity consolidated, made it into a large-scale enterprise of some sort, and then sold it and either went public or sold it to a bigger company. Next slide, please. Global manufacturing of tomorrow, how it looks like. I will make a few points here, and of course this will be distributed so you may have a copy. For the first time, it will be think global, make local, which means manufacturing will be more and more distributed, and therefore the traditional approach of trade as the driver of economic growth will go less and less, and will be replaced by as much localized distributed manufacturing as possible. So it will be decentralized manufacturing and distributed manufacturing. Fortunately, the networks today, and therefore it's very possible to glue them together through the technology. So I think it's very possible that one can organize a distributed manufacturing architecture. 3D printing will come much sooner now than I was expecting. I've been working in that field myself. 3D printing will also become much more viable and probably not volume oriented, but at least important components that can be done locally at whim, demand-driven manufacturing. Factory automation is a must. You cannot survive without factory automation. In other words, can depend on labor, especially uneducated, not so skilled labor primarily. AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning are absolutely the platforms that will be used by everybody for factory automation. Modern factories are all built like that. Foxconn, for example, that makes all the consumer electronics products, the PC products, etc. You can look at them and look at the warehousing that they do. It is mind-boggling how advanced they are compared to other manufacturing. Smart factories will be needed more and more to produce smart products. Products themselves will become more smart with embedded chips inside, and therefore the factories will have to learn how to make smart products rather than dumb products. I remember in 1968 when I did a major project on Indian machine tools. I found Indian machine tools were great, but they were electromechanical. They did not have the smartness. Now this is before the internet age, and the smart machine tools is where Japan was investing in the future. They've taken over that market essentially, and they were letting go. So the electromechanical, labor-oriented machine tools for metal bending, metal cutting, etc., which is again, I think is coming back now to have, we will have to have smart factories. Focus on design. Clearly engineering is shifting now. Engineering was the most important science or a discipline. It is now shifting toward design. Chief design officers will become more important going forward in general, but definitely in the manufacturing area, such as the automobile manufacturing, for example. And I will not take all of them later on because of the too much time is wasted or spent on this one. I will just take the last point. World will embrace a new set of global standards. Even though manufacturing will be localized, it will be standardized at the same time, which is why think global, make local becomes a lot of sense. How do you make the same things in a distributed manner, but you have an overall architecture which is pretty much, in fact, standardized in many ways. Next slide, please. As you know, I have a theory that I have evolved over time, about 25 years almost now, called the rule of three. Every industry gets into two kinds of players. On the right side of the chart are the full-line generalists. They offer all the variety and serve all the segments in the marketplace. On the left side are niche players. They are either a product specialist or they are a market specialist. In a shopping mall, you can see this thing. The anchor stores will be more like general retailers, like a Macy's, Sears, etc. And then, of course, you see a very much specialty retailers like the Foot Locker on the one hand, or lifestyle companies like the Limited, for example. This chart has been shown to be true in at least 150 product companies. You don't measure company by company, you measure by product within a company. So for example, on the right side, there is only room for 3 players, and the maximum market share usually achieved by number 1 is about 40%, then goes to 20%, then 10%. Most innovative company is number 3. It always changes the paradigm. Yes, please. That changes the paradigm. And they are more innovative than number 1 and number 2 company who have more R&D dollars and more inventions. Yes. More inventions and more patents, but they do not commercialize their own technology. On the left side are niche players. Super niche is much better position, like a 1% or less % market share. And as you grow, you're likely to fall in the ditch. So the 2 most vulnerable companies are number 3 at 5% and 5% on the other side. This chart has become very popular across all the merger acquisition specialists like Goldman Sachs. Government is using the chart about anti-monopoly laws and all that stuff. So let's go to the next slide, please. So what you have are the following rule. This is becoming now global rule of 3. I have a book coming out probably by October, November, I will have it out. We are finalizing the manuscript. So in the passenger tire industry, 3 markets were not globalized yet: the US market, the European market, and of course Japan came as a later. So Bridgestone from Japan, and of course Toyo and Yokohama more recently. We had Goodyear, Firestone, and Goodrich, out of which 2 companies have not survived in globalization. Actually, Goodyear may not survive also, is my forecast. And down the road, they may become specialty chemicals or weapons or whatever they do. BF Goodrich became an aerospace industry, for example. Michelin, Pirelli, Dunlop. Dunlop is basically gone. And this is the architecture you see as Michelin, Bridgestone, Goodyear as 3 dominant players. Automobile is the next very ready for consolidation now. This particular COVID phenomenon is going to impact on all durable goods because people have a pent-up demand, but they cannot go and buy it because they want to be cautious with their money right now. I'll pick up that point. So we really have, nobody forecasted Toyota will be number 1 at one time. Now Volkswagen Group is number 1. We don't know the future of Renault, Fiat, and Renault Nissan, for example. Fiat Chrysler, for example. All of them are in question mark intentionally. And this will impact anybody who supplies into that industry. And as you know, automobile at the assembly point is one of the largest assemblers, and there are thousands of suppliers, almost 3 deep supply function that's going to get impacted with further globalization. Next slide, please. So this used to be the old world order. Old world order was primarily 12 common market countries, Western Europe, US, Canada, Northern America. Japan is a late entrant, and all of them together produce 75% of GDP. All the value add work was done in 15 nations. The trade was also pretty large, 55%. It was 45% trade among the blocks. The rest of the trade had to do with bringing raw materials from former colonies or independent nations, however it worked out. All these countries are now aging and aging very rapidly. Japan is the lead nation. There will be fewer Japanese every month than the last month, men especially. And this is true of Germany, which is 0 population growth. We still have some growth left. Our birth rate is about 1.6, and you need a 2.1 replacement, but we are struggling with the aging population. We have more retirees. In fact, our retiree is at age 65. I have 10,000 retirees a day, which is a huge burden on the society, on social security, for example, on healthcare costs, etc., which are paid by the government or by the corporations, no matter how you look at it. And those obligations are becoming much more. At General Motors, it's fascinating. They never thought this will happen, so they thought that 9 new workers and their premium was 1 retire in terms of retirement of the corporate retirement pension plans. Today, there are 8, 9 retirees for 1 new worker coming in the field. You cannot survive. Either you renege the contracts by declaring Chapter 11, get the union and the creditors to come on the play, or you have to pay that penalty. It's all coming to reckon or roosting now, as our government is struggling with the same thing primarily. So next chart, please. Next chart. So here is the change. What used to be the old triad power is now becoming a new triad power, where US, India, and China are becoming the 3 power base, mostly because all these 3 economies are primarily going to be driven by consumer demand more so than by industrial or government demand. In United States, about 70% of the GDP is all consumer demand. China is about 55, 60. India is around the same. So consumer markets will be the driver ultimately, and therefore the supply chain manufacturing for consumer products would be the key in India. In India, infrastructure will be another one. In fact, in all these 3 areas, Japan, China is ahead of it, but the rest of the world has aging public infrastructure. So United States has to invest massively in infrastructure. India has to build a brand new infrastructure. Defense is a 3rd major driver, especially from India's viewpoint, but all these 3 economies will pump a lot of money to have more and more defense capabilities, space capabilities, and security will drive the further relationships among these 3 nations. Unfortunately, US and China are now distancing from each other. First of all, unlike the previous triad power, where there was a harmony of policy, harmony of the institutions, because when Japan got defeated and Germany got defeated, US could prevail about its view all over the world. This is not the case. China comes from a former communist rule. It has become a capitalist. They have a legacy very different. US is what I call raw cowboy capitalism. They believe in capitalism first, and only if it fails, you have some regulation. India is in between. India as a culture has never trusted capitalism historically, going back to our Vedanta and our own scriptures. More like Europe in many ways, but India still believes in capitalism at the same time. So getting them on the page together alone, given different perspectives and backgrounds and the training, is going to be very hard. The negotiations are not going to be easy. And these three economies will shape the future, which means everybody else will be held hostage till they decide what to do. India is in a very strategic position. Should it align with China? Should it align with the United States or remain neutral? To me, as a person, I'm 81 years old, I find fascinating. To me, it's a deja vu about the first government we formed where Prime Minister Nehru decided will be non-aligned and created a third movement called the non-alignment movement with Tito from Yugoslavia and Nasser from Egypt, for example, as lead. Underdeveloped countries at that time pretty much all got new independence, and it absolutely did not work. The debate is going to be what will India do around here and its policy in this triad power. US definitely would like to have India on its side. US needs India more today than India needs US, surprisingly, which is a radical thought, but it's very true. I have an institute, policy institute called India, China, America Institute. Originally, I wanted to call it China, India, America Institute, but then the acronym is CIA Institute, which is what we did not want to do. I did not want America in the front, and therefore we labeled it as India, China, America Institute. And we have a think tank which discusses debates about the role of these three nations in shaping the future world economy. Next slide, please. In this critical time, India has to reposition itself and reposition. It used to be pretty much an isolated domestic economy, license Raj. When we formed the nation, its economic platform was the Leninist thinking called the commanding heights. We followed basically the Soviet Union model. Many industries will be never allowed for the private sector. We don't trust them at all. And they will be commanding heights. Those are strategic critical industries controlled only by state enterprises. We changed with liberalization in 1991, but now we are very much will be becoming full-blown integrated global economy. And again, as I mentioned before, future is in high tech, not in low tech. So it's not the labor as a key advantage of India, it will be the technical expertise and technology-oriented people or engineers that will be making the difference in the nation primarily. Next chart, please. Next chart. So how can India compete globally? Here are 7 or 8 recommendations I made. Go back to the previous one, please. Very important to embrace global standards and global benchmarks because of the distributed manufacturing. Even if you're a domestic producer, so even for domestic products and services, you cannot have this international standards and domestic standards. You have to have one standard, which is a higher standard possible. Auto components will have to move in that direction. Pharmaceutical is almost reaching that place, and processed foods will do it sooner than the other places because of the supply chain being a lot easier to manage in that area. One can create global standards very quickly. Become a global hub for professional talent, very important one. India, while we have a Make in India strategy in place, and it's a very noble enterprise initiative by the government, actually will become Make in India in services. All large enterprises from the world, for their IT services, for the professional services like accounting, legal services, and even R&D will hub in India, especially given the tension between China and America. Become a second global sourcing destination. Clearly, world wants to de-risk from China, and therefore every nation is looking at India as a possibility. It's going to happen in services clearly because we have the talent pool. Can it happen in manufacturing? And I'm told that about 1,000 companies who do business in China right now, make products, are very seriously thinking about how to diversify from China, whether it is in Vietnam, for example, or whether it is in Brazil, for example, or wherever it is. But India can get a piece of the pie by going after those corporations in a systematic way, which means domestic competition will be global also at the same. Soft power of India should come more through globally admired brands. Made in Japan was a laughing stock when I was growing up. We used to laugh at that as we laughed at Made in China. Korea was also a laughing stock, but think about Japanese investing in quality, becoming the most admired brands. Korea followed similarly, and China is following the same way, except in China, you can get all quality, not just the low quality or a premium or a performance products, but mid-value products, any three categories they can have. So next slide, please. Next slide. Speed up digital India. I'm absolutely convinced that India's future lies with digital architecture. The technology, digital technology will bring about more change in India and transform the nation than manufacturing as we know or services as we know. Encourage foreign in India for global markets. In other words, you make it in India, not just for the Indian market, but also regional market, at least if not truly global market. Provide economic and social incentives for innovation and entrepreneurship. I think in India, we have not invested enough in R&D itself and design for that matter. I think that's going to become very, very important, but the government needs to give incentives to motivate India to become an innovator cluster rather than an imitator or copying in some fashion. I think that's very key. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. Digitize, digitize, digitize. As people have said, data is the new oil, which is what we have to really think about. The rest of the points I will not make. Invest in management education for diplomats, military, and state enterprises. They are recruited from the IAS examinations. There is very little management or business component. And I've been trying very hard to convince our government that diplomats must learn basics of business, how business works. And they are now organizing sessions at IIM Ahmedabad, IIM Lucknow, wherever they are, to teach diplomats 3-week, 4-week intensive executive education. I think that's equally important for the military, which we recruit in a separate way, and also all those state enterprise management people. They have to learn the sort of what I call a mini compressed MBA of some sort. They can understand, therefore, how business operates and what are the views, etc., as opposed to their own, either an ideology view or a different mission. Deepen diplomatic relationship with G20 nations, both professionally and personally. G20 will be very important alignment, not G7, which I thought would be a key one, but I think G20 nations balances properly the emerging economies. Let's conclude the whole thing by last slides, please. And then I'll open up for questions. Due to lockdown and social distancing, I don't think it's the COVID-19 itself, but it's reaction to manage it and control it, contain it, which has created this significant sliding of the economy worldwide. The global economy came crashing down like a high-speed elevator. It'll take several years to fully recover, climbing up only step by step. Global consolidation of industries is inevitable in the process because industry has too much debt. In the good days of low interest rates, every industry borrowed money even to buy back shares, which is very unthinkable. And therefore, the debt to equity ratio is going to have a huge problem if the stock market collapses or reduces significantly. And therefore, you have a junk bond phenomenon starting again. China will play a significant role in global consolidation, whether we like it or not. Next slide, please. Last slide. Private will rule the world for at least next 1 decade. You gotta be friends with the private capital people, sovereign funds included. Geopolitics of the world and the emergence of the new triad power will make India strategic to the world. People will be knocking the doors of India much more going forward in this decade than ever before. As India gets globally integrated, it will have to become more competitive even for domestic industries, because competition, global competition, will come in India, as we see in, for example, as we see in automobile, for example, as we see in most industries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sheth. And now we will have an opportunity of questions and answers. Professor, with your kind permission, can we go up to 9:40 if you are okay? It is 9:25 now. So if it is okay with you?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, thank you. So we would request the DICs to make any comments, any questions, or any observations.
Prem, Vikram here. There are a whole bunch of questions on the chat board. Why don't you ask those questions and Dr. Sheth can answer them? Prem, do you want to read out some of them from there?
Sure. In fact, we would take up that. And there is one question very interesting which has come up to me. And the question is that the demographic dividend, which has been seen as a big advantage for India, that India is a young country. There is a new research which has come up that by 2040, India as a country would start aging. That being the case, Professor Sheth, what is your take on this particular advantage and what would be your advice to Indian industry in general?
I think we do have the demographic dividend advantage in the short run only, but the other nations are catching up. Mexico is even younger than us, for example. Mexico is a major manufacturing hub because of the NAFTA agreement. A lot of work is done between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and most of the trade, as you know, within NAFTA is within the company, not between companies. So the international trade theory is actually no longer as relevant as it used to be. In other words, when you have a tariff on the same product that is made in one country as it is shipped out to the other country, the problem is that you are taxing the corporation both ways, primarily. So it does not work anymore. So the trade theory has to be modernized, contemporized. I do believe that demographic dividend was a nice slogan at one time, but Vietnam has a young population, which is already having huge man shift from China to Vietnam, for example, by Chinese companies. I think we probably exaggerated the demographic dividend. India will age as Chinese have aged. Ours is more voluntary. And therefore, one has to capture the advantage of the young people now, except our decision making in India is very slow because we are a democratic process. Lots of debates, discussions go on, and therefore it will be very important to make sure that we take the advantage of demographic dividend now. My worry in India is different. I think we have growing senior citizen population who feel totally alienated from society because they had a social contract. They raised kids with the expectations that the kids will take care of them when they age. But today I find the senior citizens living by themselves have absolutely worry about their own future. Nobody calls from them. It's a problem all over the world. We have a problem here. So I think demographic dividend is not the future. As I mentioned very strongly in my presentation twice now, 3 times, ultimately you have to automate the factories. Work has to be automated as opposed to looking at work as a place to support the employment or the labor primarily.
Thank you, Professor Sheth. There is another question which has come up. Any such crisis like COVID also makes civilizations, people, industries to come up with very new and innovative ideas and solutions and businesses. Do you foresee the emergence of new kinds of businesses, particularly for a country like India?
Oh, definitely. And there are 3-4 categories of new businesses. The most common category would be leveraging the information industry infrastructure in India, which is the mobile phones and the networks behind, the databases, data centers, and ride on that one, and anything that is manual, make it online essentially. Huge opportunity. It's more than a Flipkart alone, which is just an e-commerce platform for delivering at home, or Amazon. We are talking about I can do anything. So you have the fintech on the one hand, you have the health net, for example, and this is where I think for the first time I see large enterprises as opposed to startup entrepreneurs, or entrepreneurship by necessity because you're laid off, you have to do something in your life. I think it'll be large enterprises who will jump in to say that how can I actually disrupt myself? So if you're a bank, like the SBI, for example, all the national banks or private banks, they have to say, how can I go online myself? And therefore I shift customers from coming to the branch offices and making them better and better to actually shift it online. One of the more successful stories recently of shifting from a brick and mortar to an online has been Walmart, surprisingly to all of us, because Walmart is heavily real estate asset-based company, physical inventory, and they actually acquired a jet company or something like that and have ramped up, and they've done quite well in the transition, especially with the COVID. So clearly, technology enable anything that's like a fintech sounding, anything that's technology based, not the product and the competence based, but the network based would be clearly one area. Second area is that this is a century for biological sciences. Last century was all physics and chemistry, mechanics and chemistry. I think chemistry is giving way to more and more biological breakthroughs. So biotech, as it is called quite often, will be the next wave. We know how to clone anything today. I mean, I remember cloning of natural pearls into cultural pearls. Today, I can make better quality and better shape, better color, better size cultural pearls, which is a standalone industry. I can clone a shrimp, for example. I can clone a cow. I can clone a human even. So with the DNA discovery has shifted the whole notion that chemistry is the driver as opposed to biotech or biological chemistry, for example. In chemistry, so anything that has to do with biological sciences will be another major driver. Third major driver, and that's where the innovation will come and new companies will come, is going to be everything but sustainability. While sustainability is a societal problem on a global basis, it is equally important an opportunity. If you can come out with anything that enhances the sustainability of the physical environment, whether it's a carbon reduction in factories, for example, or whatever it is, whether it's an alternate energy, I don't care, but there's a whole phenomenon of sustainability which has huge set of inventions businesses will come standalone. It's very similar, and to me, it's like S&P 500, which was designed for industrial companies. And you saw General Electric, for example, General Motors as dominant in S&P. Today, if you look at S&P or Dow Jones, especially among the top 30, 7 of the top 10 companies are all Silicon Valley. So we've already gone from the electromechanical age to the software electronic age anyhow, and stock market is blessing those companies. Their market caps like Apple, Google, Microsoft even are just outrageous compared to traditional manufacturing. So you will see industries like that coming out. The fourth area I wanted to quickly mention is all about how do I consume smartly. Smart consumption is a very key platform. People waste enormously. Traditionally, reduce use is a phenomenon, but it's more than that. So smart consumption, clearly sustainability, innovations, environmental issues, biological sciences, and anything that's digitally based innovation to shift the industry from manual, physical to online, like Amazon did against department stores or retailers in general.
Thank you, Professor Sheth. There is another question that there has been a lot of talk about many American, Japanese, and European companies trying to shift base out of our neighbor country, large country, and therefore, is there, because of this trust deficit, is there any specific opportunity you would see, particularly for Indian industry?
I would look at more the geographical realignment in that new triad power I talked about. And here is the new area, and those countries will give signals to their industry to move their factories in a certain way. It is not strictly a private sector, their own decision, please. It's always having a government blessing, if not government nudging kind of notion. The new architecture is Australia coming in the limelight, Japan, Australia, and maybe South Korea. They already are very comfortable in India, except Australia. Japanese, make products in India have done since Sony days that I remember. And South Korea dominates in India in appliances, LG, for example, or Samsung. I'm talking about white goods appliances, as opposed to consumer electronics, for example, like a Samsung cell phones, Samsung, whatever it is. So I do believe that there will be a shift, but here is the twist. In India, they may come more for a third-party manufacturer. I would watch those contract manufacturing companies like the Foxconn that I mentioned. They will be the trigger point because they are willing to take the risk because they have multiple customers base and their factories are designed in a way they can be more flexible, etc. I can make multiple products even for that matter. I think I would watch companies like Foxconn as to what they are doing in India. You already saw the announcement pretty much, which is again an interesting architecture, Facebook investing in Reliance Jio. I've done a lot of advising in telephone industry for 30 years, 35 years, the Bell system here. And I've always claimed that the largest retailer is the telephone company. Remember, they were retailers way back when people had to lease their telephone from the telephone company. You could not buy your own. That was the mandate by government. And therefore, they have had a footprint universal. Everybody had a telephone. And I think, therefore, Reliance Jio will become the largest retailer online out of nowhere, as they are the largest network provider right now. They're gunning for it. And therefore, retailers in India, such as Amazon online or Flipkart, will have a competition coming primarily from a domestic player here who has the scale and the size. And Facebook realizes they have to go beyond advertising revenues to be becoming a market exchange. So there's another that possibility. So I would look at the geo alignment first. I also believe that in India, manufacturing will come surprisingly also in the defense industry. Defense players, Japan is a big defense player, by the way, even though they were not allowed to make, but they are now liberalized. Israel is a nice little niche player, but significant. America is a large defense supplier. They will probably start doing more and more manufacturing in India, and India defense industries basically are privatized or will be privatized. Private sector will be allowed to participate in the defense industry, just like the cell phones that we did. And the last area that I know more money will come from America would be in public sector infrastructure. I believe very strongly that in addition to the railroad and the roads, what India needs very quickly is hundreds of airports and dozens of seaports very quickly. You cannot make it in India unless you have a shipping and logistics architecture in place. China benefited by Hong Kong architecture. Shenzhen was so nearby, they could do it. We have really a bottleneck over there, and therefore the alignment will have some frictions for the export market. If the companies come to make it there, but sell it in other markets, regional markets even, one has to have public infrastructure. And the best way to organize now is a public-private partnership. It's very possible. Where private capital comes from those companies that I mentioned, you have the expertise coming from foreign companies who know how to build large-scale infrastructures, and your domestic partner and the government. Long answer, I'm so sorry.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sheth, for your time. And may I now request Harshpati ji, Shri Harshpati Singhania, for doing a conclusion remark and propose a vote of thanks on behalf of JKO.
Professor Sheth, thank you so much for the time and accommodation of by shifting these hours. Your talk and presentation has indeed been very fascinating. Certainly gives, I think, every participant great food for thought, and it reinforces some of the things that we have been talking about and our policymakers have been talking about. Quite clearly, some of your things in terms of your faith, and not just faith, but backed by facts, that India can really be a global player across things, and while also capitalizing on our huge domestic market, I think will give us things of how we will proceed. Your thoughts around, embracing technology, and if I understood you, India can make that change faster because we have certain things which are embedded in our ecosystem, and really becoming part of the troika that you have talked about. ICA instead of CIA. I like that acronym, and that is most interesting. I know you are pressed for time, so I will not repeat what you have said. But I just want to say that actually in India, with help from people like you, we have, thinking and thoughts that are possible. What we really need is the execution ability to do many of these things. Because as you know, and we have learned from professors like you, that God lies in the details. And it's really the execution and the speed at which we are able to do this, which will determine whether India can keep, if I may paraphrase Jawaharlal Nehru, his tryst with destiny in terms of really getting there. And also our competitiveness as a nation is going to be determined by a lot of things that you talked about. Our investments in the factor input costs, in infrastructure, in cost of capital, how we harness this labor productivity. All of those things I think you alluded to. Those are going to be really the most important thing. And if I may just cap this by saying that we heard tonight our Prime Minister talk not only of an economic stimulus package, but more importantly, he talked about a reliant India, and also an India which can be producing local and become a part of the globe. So in a way, this is exactly what you are also saying. So thank you very much on behalf of JK Lakshmipat University and as well as the JK organization and each and every participant who's here on this. And once again, we would like to compliment you on getting the Padma Bhushan this year. We are really proud of you, Dr. Sheth. Thank you indeed.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Great pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time. And it was great listening to Professor Sheth. Thank you, Professor Sheth. Thank you all to everyone joining from various parts of the country. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.